Hey guys, let's start with a story tonight. Marianne, a journalist specializing in urban legends and with a memory gap, uncovered the truth that the city is actually a life form with a collective subconscious and uses the statue as a trauma control valve when investigating the mystery of the statue moving in the middle of the night in Brussels Square. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And tell me in the comments where you started tuning in and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see people from all over the world join us. The moonlight on the 13th night was like a crumpled sheet of silver foil smoothed out again, carrying the unique chill of winter, spread over the cobblestones of Brussels' Grand Place. The water trapped in the cracks of the cobblestones had formed a thin layer of ice. At 3:17 a.m., Pierre Lemerle's rubber boots crunched over it first, then squelched softly, the sound unusually clear in the silent square. His flashlight beam swept over the spires of the Gothic buildings surrounding the square, where carved stone lions and angels cast grotesque yet compassionate shadows in the moonlight, before finally resting on the bronze statue in the center, known as the Sleeper. His fingers suddenly froze, and the hand holding the flashlight trembled slightly. Not an illusion. The bronze man, seated with his eyes closed and curled up, had bent his knees at a sharper angle than the night before, as if huddling deeper into himself to ward off some invisible cold. Pierre had been a night watchman at the square for 20 years. His father had held the same job before him, and when he handed over the heavy bunch of keys on his deathbed, he said, "Every cobblestone in the Grand Place has a story to tell." The Sleeper had stood there since its inauguration in 1948, its bronze surface worn smooth by the years, the compassion in its features like ink dissolved in water, too dense to fade. Over the past 12 nights, similar strange changes had occurred. Sometimes its head tilted slightly toward the blackened window of City Hall. Sometimes its clasped hands loosened by half an inch, fingertips seemingly reaching for the ground. The movements were so subtle that only someone who stared at the statue every day, someone who could even name the position of each fold in its bronze robes, could have noticed. For the first few nights, he had thought his eyes were failing him, secretly dabbing at them with eye drops repeatedly. But when the beam of light fixed on the statue's knees that night, the clear change in angle made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. This was no natural phenomenon. This thing, it was like it was alive. Pierre swallowed hard and mustered up the courage to approach the statue. The cold of the bronze seeped through his thick coat, sending a shiver down his spine. He held the flashlight close to the folds of the statue's knees and finally made out the small object wedged in the gap. A tiny button. It was not a standardized modern industrial product. Its edges had a rounded curve from hand polishing, and its surface was oxidized to a deep brown rust. Yet the delicate pattern carved on it was still visible, a lily of the valley, its petals as slender as real ones. Pierre pulled a small pair of tweezers from his pocket, his fingers trembling with nervousness as he carefully extracted the button with great effort. He brought it to his nose and smelled it. Apart from the rusty scent of bronze, there was a faint, musty odor like old fabric. Under the moonlight, he squinted to make out the blurred numbers engraved on the back of the button. After staring for a long time, he finally read them. 1937. The year was like a cold key, inserting itself into the lock of his memory. It was the year his grandfather had often spoken of, when the shadow of war began to loom over Europe. A 1937 school uniform button. The next morning, when Pierre handed the button over to the square administration office, the young clerk Lucy couldn't help but exclaim. Her nails were painted light pink, and she pointed at her phone screen for Pierre to see. "Mr. Lemerle, look at this." On the screen, #walking statue had rocketed to the top of Belgium's social media trending topics, marked with a red, explosive icon. Someone had posted carefully crafted comparison photos, overlaying images of the Sleeper from a week ago with those from that morning, marking the path of its movement with red lines that clearly showed the statue had shifted approximately 30 centimeters northeastward. Others had uploaded blurry nighttime videos, in which the ground around the statue seemed to undulate slightly, like a breathing chest. What's more, in the comments section, people shared photos of old doll parts they had found near the statue's base. A rag doll with a broken arm, its skirt stained with brown marks that looked like dried blood. Half a tin frog, its spring rusted but still able to pop slightly with a creak. The comments section was in chaos. Some called it a supernatural phenomenon, others a prank by environmentalists, and still others feared it was a precursor to an earthquake. Experts were summoned quickly, scurrying about like ants in a hot pan. Archaeologists probed the statue repeatedly with metal detectors, confirming it was a product of the post-World War II reconstruction period, made from local Belgian copper or mixed with small fragments of wartime shrapnel. Geologists drilled for soil samples around the statue's base, finding nothing unusual except for higher humidity, nearly 30% higher than in other parts of the square. Even neuroscientists arrived with sophisticated brainwave detectors, setting up 3 monitoring points around the statue, but after a full day and night of monitoring, they only recorded normal ambient noise. The flutter of pigeon wings, the footsteps of tourists, and the toll of church bells in the distance. It might be bronze deformation caused by thermal expansion and contraction, a white-haired expert explained solemnly to the cameras, pushing up his gold-rimmed glasses. His words were immediately drowned out by boos and objections from the audience. Everyone knew the coefficient of thermal expansion for bronze, and with Brussels temperatures stabilizing between 5 and 10 degrees Celsius in recent days, it was impossible to cause such regular, directional movement. Some audience members even pulled out their phones to show the previous night's temperature records, refuting the experts' claim. The press conference ended hastily in chaos, with experts fleeing the scene, leaving behind a crowd of journalists and angry citizens. In the chaotic press conference hall, Marion Coleman leaned against a Roman column at the back, her fingers scribbling furiously in a leather notebook. The rustle of the pen against the paper was unusually clear amid the noise. Her black curly hair was loosely pinned up with an old silver hairpin, a few strands falling to frame her cheeks, hiding the faint scar at the corner of her eye, the only trace left by her lost memories. As a journalist specializing in urban legends for the Brussels Free Press, Marianne had a natural sensitivity to such unexplainable anomalies, perhaps related to the parts of her past she could not recall. She had always felt that those forgotten memories held the key to unlocking the weird. More importantly, when she saw the sleeper's closed-eyed, forbearing posture on the big screen, a hidden corner of her heart suddenly throbbed, a faint, familiar yet unfamiliar pain, as if someone had tapped gently on her chest. She stared at the compassion in the statue's features, sensing endless sorrow, as if it were mourning something from a distant past. Ms. Coleman, after the press conference, the head of the Square Administration Office approached her. "We need a journalist who can report on this objectively to calm public panic. Your previous article, The Mirror Mystery of the Magritte Museum, was excellent. Would you be willing to take on this story?" Marion closed her notebook and looked up at the statue in the center of the square. Sunlight streamed through the spires of the Gothic buildings, casting dappled shadows on the bronze surface. In the folds of the bronze that the experts had overlooked, it seemed as if countless pairs of eyes were watching. "I'm not interested in calming panic," she said softly. "I'm interested in finding the truth." On her first day of the investigation, Marianne moved her office to a cafe near the Grand Place called Café du Temps Perdu. The cafe's walls were exposed red brick, adorned with black and white photos of old Brussels, and the air was filled with the aroma of espresso and freshly baked waffles. She rented a window seat from which she could clearly see the entrance to the square. For the next 3 days, she spent almost all her time poring over documents. The cafe owner, a kind middle-aged woman, noticed she always ordered a black coffee and sat for hours, occasionally bringing her a complimentary waffle. Marion read through 13 years of reports related to the square, from festivals to tourist disputes, but found no unusual records. On the fourth day, she dragged a suitcase full of materials to the City Hall archives, and in the unfiled section of the basement, a set of dust-covered boxes marked 1978 fire remnants caught her attention. The boxes were made of dark brown cardboard, their edges softened by moisture, with unsolved cases written in blue ink, the handwriting somewhat faded. She put on gloves and carefully opened one of the boxes. Inside, the papers were mostly yellowed, some with charred edges, emitting a smell of old paper and faint smoke. In 1978, a fire had broken out in the archives building west of City Hall, destroying a large number of unsolved post-World War II case files. These were the only surviving fragments. "Is there a pattern to the file numbers?" Marian asked the archivist over the phone. "They all start with the letter F, followed by 3 digits," the archivist replied, his voice crackling with static. "Like F047, F123. They're all cases of post-war missing persons, never solved because they're so old. After the fire, they became complete mysteries." Hanging up the phone, Marianne suddenly remembered the old dolls people had posted on social media. She quickly opened her phone's favorites and pulled up the photos, zooming in to check the marks on the dolls. The inside of the broken-armed ragdoll's collar was embroidered with a small red thread F, followed by 3 digits. 079. The bottom of the half-tin frog was stamped with F156, the same font as the file numbers. A chill ran down her spine, her fingertips going cold. All the old dolls corresponded exactly to the numbers of the unsolved cases destroyed in the fire. This was no coincidence. Marian stood up and walked to the cafe window, looking toward the Grand Place. The afternoon sun was shining brightly, and the square was crowded with tourists, taking photos of the sleeper and laughing. No one knew the secrets hidden behind the silent statue and the old dolls. She suddenly felt that the statue was like a silent messenger, trying to convey the truths buried by fire and time in its own way. To obtain more precise clues, Marian sought out the technician responsible for the square's surveillance, a young man named Thomas. Thomas's office was in the basement of City Hall, filled with monitoring equipment and wires, with a dozen monitors on the wall displaying real-time footage of every corner of the square. After Marian explained her purpose, Thomas sighed helplessly and pointed to the surveillance records on his computer screen. "Ms. Coleman, it's not that I don't want to help you. Look at this." The screen showed that for the past 13 nights, the surveillance cameras in the center of the square had shut down precisely at 3:03 a.m. and resumed at 4:01 a.m. It's not equipment failure. We've replaced 3 new cameras, but the result is the same. What's even stranger is that during the shutdowns, the equipment's voltage and signal are normal, as if it's being jammed by some unknown signal that forcibly blocks the images from this area. Thomas pulled up the sound wave data from before the shutdowns and handed Marianne a USB drive. "This is the sound wave recording I saved privately. It might be useful to you." Marian took the USB drive, her fingertips brushing against Thomas's cool fingers. His eyes were a mix of curiosity and fear. "Do you really believe that statue can move on its own?" Marianne did not answer, only nodded and turned to leave the basement. She knew she had to figure out the secrets hidden in the sound wave data as soon as possible. Leonardo's laboratory was in an abandoned old school, far from the hustle and bustle of the city center, so quiet that the faint hum of the equipment could be heard. The walls of the laboratory were covered with various sound wave graphs, and the shelves were filled with glass bottles and instruments of all sizes. Leonardo had been Marianne's classmate in university. Both had been top students in the physics department. Later, Leonardo specialized in sound wave analysis and became a well-known expert in the field. Seeing Marian enter, he put down the beaker in his hand and took the USB drive she handed him. "Another weird case?" Marian smiled and said nothing, watching as he imported the sound wave data into the analysis system. A fluctuating curve soon appeared on the screen, its undulations gentle yet rhythmic. "Is this a brainwave?" Marian stared at the screen, her voice trembling. The curve's frequency range was between 0.5 and 4 Hz, exactly the delta brainwave frequency of human deep sleep, and its smoothness and regularity were surprisingly similar to human brainwaves. It's not a single brainwave. Leonardo adjusted the parameters. His brows furrowed as he typed quickly on the keyboard, splitting the curve into countless tiny branches. Look, these branches have different frequencies. Some belong to adults, some to children, even some to the elderly. It's more like an aggregate of countless overlapping brainwaves. I call it a collective neural frequency. He paused and turned to Marianne, his eyes filled with shock. Marianne, are you sure this was collected from around the statue? This kind of frequency usually only appears at large collective events like religious ceremonies or concerts, and its intensity is never this stable. It's like countless people's consciousness are trapped in that area, forming a stable field of consciousness. Leonardo's words made Marianne's heart beat faster. She thought of the old dolls and the unsolved cases. Could these collective neural frequencies be the residual consciousness of the victims? Marian nodded, her fingertips unconsciously brushing the edge of her notebook. The sky outside was growing dark, and the setting sun cast long shadows through the laboratory windows. The sound of evening prayers drifted from the direction of the grand place, distant and heavy, as if mourning the dead. She suddenly remembered the 1937 button Pierre had found, 1937, 2 years before the outbreak of World War II, when the air in Brussels was already thick with the haze of war. People back then had probably sensed the impending disaster, their hearts filled with fear and anxiety. The button, the dolls, and the strange collective neural frequency all seemed to point in the same direction. The past buried by time, the unrest souls, the pain accumulated in the city's soil. Marian stood up, thanked Leonardo, and hurried out of the laboratory. She needed to go to that old bookstore. She had a hunch that Mr. Etienne held the key to unlocking all the mysteries. In the days that followed, Marian spent almost all her time at the Grand Place. She arrived early every morning and left late at night, trying to keep watch near the statue at 3 a.m., but only felt a piercing cold and endless silence. It was a strange silence, not the absence of sound, but the absorption of all sound, even the wind growing faint. She had tried placing a recorder next to the statue, but it only picked up static. On the 7th evening, a sudden downpour swept over Brussels. The raindrops were large, pounding the cobblestones with a clatter, and tourists scattered for shelter. Marianne didn't have time to run to the distant cafe, so she rushed along the colonnade around the square and finally took refuge in an old bookstore. The bookstore's door was wooden, carved with intricate patterns, creaking as she pushed it open. The air was filled with the musty smell of old books and ink, and warm yellow light poured down from the ceiling chandelier, bringing a sense of warmth. The bookstore owner was an elderly man with white hair, wearing a gray wool sweater, sitting behind the cash register reading a book. When he saw the photo of the sleeper in her hand, he put down the book and approached her. "You're investigating that statue?" The old man's voice was hoarse, etched with the weight of years. "Yes, sir. Do you know anything about it?" Marian asked eagerly. "My name is Etienne Dupont. I used to be an urban planner for this city." The old man poured her a cup of hot cocoa, his gaze drifting to the square outside the window. "That statue is related to a secret agreement during post-war reconstruction." Etienne's words were like a key, unlocking a forgotten chapter of history. He refilled Marianne's cup of hot cocoa, took a sip of his own, and stared out at the square, as if transported back to the post-war era of chaos and destruction. In 1945, after World War II ended, Brussels was almost in ruins. Etienne's voice was thick with memory. "I was only 20 years old then, fresh out of architecture school, working with my mentor on the city's reconstruction. You can't imagine what it was like. Streets filled with craters, old buildings pockmarked with bullet holes, people's faces without a trace of joy. their eyes numb and sorrowful. Once, while clearing debris, I saw a little girl squatting in a corner, hugging a tattered rag doll, crying and calling for her mother. Later, I learned that her parents had been killed in the bombings, and that doll was her only memento. Etienne sighed, his eyes filled with pain. At the time, city officials noticed that after the trauma of the war, people were overcome with anxiety and panic, and the entire city was shrouded in an oppressive atmosphere. Suicide and crime rates soared, and children had nightmares constantly. So they secretly gathered a group of neuroscientists, artists, and urban planners to launch a project called the Urban Neural Hub Project. Our goal was simple: to find a way to make the city come alive again, to help people heal from their trauma. Etienne paused, then continued. We wanted to encode collective trauma into public art, allowing the city to process that pain in its own way. Just as the human body heals wounds automatically, we hoped the city could develop a similar self-healing ability. The sleeper is one of the core works of this project. Etienne tapped his fingers gently on the table, the rhythm slow and heavy. Its designer was my mentor, an architect named Auguste Coleman. When she heard the name Auguste Coleman, Marianne's heart skipped a beat. It was the same as her own surname, but before she could think more about it, she was drawn back to Etienne's words. But I don't know the exact design principles. Very few people were involved in the core design, only Mr. Auguste and a few neuroscientists, and we all signed strict non-disclosure agreements. Etienne pulled a yellowed notebook from the shelf, its cover worn and frayed, with Urban Reconstruction Notes 1948, written on it in fountain pen. He handed it to Marianne. This is my work journal from back then, with some scattered records about the Urban Neural Hub project and a hand-drawn cross-section of the statue's base. It might help you. Marianne took the notebook, her fingertips brushing its rough cover, as if touching the temperature of that era. She flipped it open, finding neat, firm handwriting recording post-war reconstruction data and blueprints. On the last few pages, she saw a hand-drawn cross-section of the statue's base, marked with a bioactive zone in red ink, accompanied by a small note: metal strain, emotion-sensitive, growth-driven. Etienne told her that this zone was located exactly 3 meters below the statue's base, and during the construction, he had witnessed workers pouring a silvery white liquid into it, said to contain a special bioactive metal strain. Marianne held the notebook, her fingertips tracing its rough cover. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, documenting post-war reconstruction data and blueprints. On the last few pages, she saw a hand-drawn cross-section of the statue's base, labeled with bioactive zone. Etienne told her that this zone was located exactly 3 meters below the statue's base. Early the next morning, Marianne brought geological testing equipment to the Grand Place. With the permission of the Square Administration Office, she drilled a small hole next to the statue's base and collected soil samples from below. To ensure the accuracy of the test results, she sent the samples to 3 different laboratories. 3 days later, the test reports from all 3 labs arrived, their results surprisingly consistent. The soil contained a rare bioactive metal strain, artificially cultivated, never before found in nature. In the report, the laboratory researchers wrote that this strain could produce a growth response to specific emotional frequencies. When the concentration of negative emotions in the surrounding environment was too high, the strain would accelerate its growth, secreting a special mucus that altered the hardness and structure of the surrounding soil. When positive emotions prevailed, the strain's growth would slow. Marianne looked at the test report, finally understanding the reason for the statue's movement. The strain's growth would change the soil structure, in turn pushing the statue to shift. But why had it only started moving in the past 13 nights? Could it be that the collective pain of the city had accumulated to a critical point? She thought of recent events in Brussels. Economic recession leading to high unemployment, geopolitical instability causing widespread anxiety, and the terrorist attacks a few years earlier that had left indelible psychological scars. This pain, like drops of water, had slowly accumulated in the city's soil, finally reaching the threshold to activate the strain 13 days ago. "That's why the statue is moving?" Marian muttered, staring at the test report. The strain's growth altered the soil's hardness, pushing the statue to shift. But why had it only started moving in the past 13 nights? Could it be that the collective pain of the city had accumulated to a critical point? Questions flooded her mind, and even stranger things began to happen to Marian herself. She started having recurring dreams. In the darkness, she could only see a child with an indistinct face, piecing together broken toys deep beneath the square. The child's cries were intermittent, piercing her heart like needles. What shocked her even more was that one early morning, when she returned to the grand place, she found a familiar rabbit doll at the sleeper's feet. It was the toy she had lost in her childhood. Its soft white fur had yellowed, one ear was torn off, and one button I was missing. She picked it up tremblingly and found a button sewn to its hem. Exactly the same type of 1937 lily of the valley button Pierre had found, with a faint nickname carved on it. Lily. Lily. That was her childhood nickname. She hadn't heard it since she lost the rabbit doll at the grand place when she was 10 years old. Even stranger, her memories of her childhood at the square were almost completely blank, as if erased with an eraser. Doctors had told her it was memory loss caused by post-traumatic stress disorder, but she had never known what trauma she had endured. Physiological changes became more and more apparent. Every time she approached the sleeper, she heard faint whispers in her ears, countless voices overlapping, as if coming from far away. Listening closely, she could make out fragments. The shrill, urgent wail of air raid sirens during the 1944 German bombings, mixed with women's screams and children's cries. The hoarse yet powerful singing of citizens protesting nuclear waste disposal in 1985, lyrics filled with love for their homeland and hope for the future. The silence after the 2016 terrorist attacks, the wind carrying a heavy sigh, occasionally broken by soft sobs and calls for loved ones. These fragmented soundscapes, spanning time, played like a living history of the city in her mind, carrying different emotional temperatures. Fear, anger, sorrow, hope. Once, she even heard a familiar nursery rhyme in the soundscape, its simple, cheerful melody bringing tears to her eyes. She knew it was the song her mother had often sung to her as a child, but she couldn't remember the full lyrics. These soundscapes were no longer cold fragments of sound, but warm, emotional memories, making her more acutely aware that the city was not a silent container, but a living, remembering, feeling being. Marian realized there was a special connection between herself, the city, and the statue. She went to see Etienne again, hoping to learn more about the core of the Urban Neural Hub project. But this time, Etienne was in very poor health, lying in a hospital bed, his breathing weak, his face pale. "Child, you're finally here." When Etienne saw her, a glimmer of light appeared in his cloudy eyes. He struggled to pull a handwritten manuscript from under his pillow and pressed it into Marianne's hand. "This is the truth. The sleeper is not an ordinary statue. It's a pressure valve for the city's trauma." Marianne held the heavy manuscript, her fingertips white with tension. Etienne's voice grew softer, telling her the complete design principle. Back then, Mr. Auguste discovered that the city as a massive living organism has a collective unconscious. Every street, every building, every cobblestone remembers the stories that happened here and carries people's emotions. Etienne coughed, his breathing becoming more labored. When the unresolved collective pain accumulated in a specific area reaches a threshold, the bioactive metal strain buried beneath the statue's base is activated, driving the statue to move through growth. It's a visualized morning ritual. A spark of light flickered in his eyes, as if proud of this great discovery, yet sorrowful for those who had passed. Mr. Auguste said that the city's pain needs to be seen, to be heard, to be healed. Just like a person, keeping pain bottled up only makes the wound fester. Only by speaking it aloud can it slowly heal. That damp soil is the city shedding tears. Etienne's lips curved into a faint smile, filled with relief. Those old dolls are concrete memory vessels summoned by the city. Each doll corresponds to an unresolved traumatic story. The statue's movement, is it telling us we refuse to be frozen in trauma? It's searching for a direction to calm the city. With those words, Etienne's eyes closed forever, his hands still tightly clutching a yellowed photo of a group of workers in overalls standing in front of the newly completed sleeper, smiling brightly. Later, Marianne recognized the man in the center of the photo as her great-grandfather, Auguste Coleman. She gently pulled the photo from Etienne's hand and carefully placed it in her notebook. The hospital monitors let out a shrill alarm, and doctors and nurses rushed in. Marianne stood up silently and walked out of the ward. The corridor lights were pale, casting a cold glow on her face. Etienne's death had robbed her of her only source of clues, but it had also strengthened her resolve to fulfill his last wish, to help the city heal from its wounds. Etienne's death plunged Marianne into deep grief, but the manuscript revealed all the mysteries. She finally understood that the statue's movement over the past 13 nights was because Brussels' collective trauma had reached a critical point. Perhaps it was the recent economic recession or geopolitical unrest that had accumulated so much pain in the city, forcing it to launch this long-overdue mourning ritual. But just as she sorted out the truth, news came from City Hall. Due to the public panic caused by the statue's movement and a stampede among tourists gathering to watch it, City Hall decided to permanently fix the sleeper in 3 days' time, pouring concrete around its base to prevent any further movement. The decision was like a bucket of cold water, dashing Marianne's hopes. She knew that once the statue was fixed, the city's trauma pressure valve would be permanently closed, and the unresolved collective pain would erupt in more terrifying ways. She had to stop it, but how? Should she reveal the truth? She wasn't sure if the public could accept the revolutionary idea that the city is a living organism. It might only cause greater panic. On the night before the planned intervention, Marianne sat alone on the cobblestones of the Grand Place until the moon reached its zenith. She approached the sleeper again, and the soundscape fragments in her ears became clearer. This time, she heard a familiar voice, a woman's call, "Lily, come here quickly. Mommy's here." In an instant, countless fragmented memories exploded in her mind. It was a summer day when she was 10 years old, visiting the Grand Place with her mother. Suddenly, a small anti-terrorism drill began, and the crowd panicked. In the chaos, she had become separated from her mother, and the rabbit doll in her arms had fallen to the ground. She squatted in the corner of the square, crying, watching the panicked crowd around her, filled with fear. At that moment, she thought she saw the sleeper's eyes move slightly, gazing at her gently. Then, a stranger approached and led her to safety. The floodgates of memory opened wide, and the family secret emerged. She returned home, dug out the old trunk left by her grandfather, and found a diary at the bottom. The diary belonged to her great-grandfather, Auguste Coleman. It detailed his entire involvement in the Urban Neural Hub project. He had been one of the core designers of the project. The diary read, "It's possible that someone in our descendants will inherit our sensitivity to the city. When the city's pain reaches a critical point, the system will automatically seal their traumatic memories, protecting them from being overwhelmed by emotional shock." Marianne finally understood. Her memory loss was not an accident, but a temporary seal imposed by the city's system to protect her. At dawn, Marianne made her decision. Instead of revealing the truth, She contacted local TV stations and newspapers to launch an event called Memory Claim. She set up a temporary stage in the Grand Place, inviting citizens to anonymously share their stories related to the old dolls and the city. In the event announcement, she wrote, "Every forgotten story deserves to be heard. Every unresolved pain needs to be accepted." On the first day of the event, not many people came. Everyone watched from a distance, curious and hesitant, whispering to each other. Marian stood beside the stage, feeling anxious, unsure if her decision was correct. Then, an elderly woman with white hair, leaning on a cane, slowly walked onto the stage, and the crowd fell silent. The old woman was wearing a black coat, her face lined with wrinkles, her eyes filled with deep sorrow. In her hands, she held a tattered rag doll, the same broken-arm doll that had been posted online. "My name is Margaret," the old woman said, her voice hoarse with age. "This doll belonged to my brother. In 1944, during the German bombing of Brussels, my brother and I got separated at the Grand Place. That day, I had taken him to the square to feed the pigeons when the air raid sirens sounded, and the crowd panicked. I held onto his hand tightly, but we were swept apart by the people. All I remember is that he was holding this doll, crying and calling my name." The old woman's voice choked, and she pulled a handkerchief from her pocket to wipe her tears. "I searched for him my entire life, but I never found any trace of him. The fire destroyed the files, and I don't even know if his name was ever recorded. All these years, I've come to the Grand Place every year, sitting beside the statue, waiting for him to come back." The old woman placed the doll on the table in the center of the stage. "Today, I want to tell this story, not because I hope to find him, but because I want him to know that his sister never forgot him. If he's no longer with us, I hope he can rest in peace." With that, the old woman bowed deeply to the statue and walked off the stage. Soft sobs echoed through the crowd, and several elderly people wiped their eyes. The old woman's story was like a stone thrown into a pond, sending ripples through the crowd. More and more people were moved, stepping onto the stage to share their stories. An elderly craftsman with white hair brought a rusty tin toolbox containing an unfinished wooden spoon. He said it was a memento from his father, a carpenter who had died in the 1978 archives fire while trying to save a file on the restoration of old buildings. The wooden spoon was a birthday gift his father had been making for him. "I always resented my father, thinking he had abandoned my mother and me for a file," the craftsman said, his voice trembling. "Today, I finally understand. Those files contain the memories of many old buildings and the stories of many people. My father didn't abandon us. He was protecting the city's memories." A young girl brought an old music box, which still played a faint melody when opened. She said the music box had been left to her by her grandmother, who had been orphaned during World War II and adopted by a kind citizen. Her grandmother had always said that Brussels was a warm city, and even in the aftermath of war, there were always strangers willing to lend a helping hand. "Before she died, my grandmother told me to always remember the warmth of this city and pass it on," the girl said, her eyes shining with tears. "Today, I want to tell her story, to remind everyone that this city has not only trauma, but also warmth and hope." After each story, people placed the corresponding old doll or memento in a box beside the stage. Marian stood in the corner of the stage, watching, her eyes moist. She could clearly feel the oppressive atmosphere lifting, replaced by a warm, steady force. She noticed that as more and more stories were told, the statue's movements grew smaller. On the first night, it moved less than a centimeter. On the second night, the movement diminished to millimeters. By the third night, after the last citizen shared their story, the statue stopped moving entirely. Marian stood in the corner of the stage, watching. She noticed that as more and more stories were told, the statue's movements grew smaller. On the first night, it moved less than a centimeter. On the second night, the movement diminished to millimeters. By the third night, after the last citizen shared their story, the statue stopped moving entirely. When City Hall officials arrived at the square, they were greeted by a warm, peaceful scene. Citizens sat around the statue, sharing food and stories, no longer filled with panic or anxiety. They ultimately abandoned the plan to fix the statue, only installing a low guardrail around it to protect the artwork that carried the city's memories. A week later, Marianne returned to the Grand Place. The early morning sun shone on the sleeper's bronze surface, casting a warm glow, and the dampness caused by the strain's mucus had completely disappeared. The statue had finally come to rest at a subtle angle facing the sunrise, its closed-eyed, curled posture no longer bearing the weight of suppressed sorrow, but instead a sense of peace and tranquility. She noticed a memory exchange box had been placed in the corner of the square, made of old wood, carved with the words, "The city's memories." The box was filled with all kinds of notes, written with messages people wanted to share with the city or fragments of their cherished memories. Marian bent down and gently opened the box, flipping through the notes one by one. Someone had written, "Thank you, city, for embracing my sorrow." Another note read, "May we all be treated with kindness in the days to come." Still another, "Those who have passed are never truly gone. They have become part of the city, watching over us." A neatly folded note caught her attention. The paper was old, like decades-old stationery, with words written in blue ink, "Dear Lily, if you ever see this note, remember that Mommy loves you forever." When she saw the nickname Lily, Marianne's heart skipped a beat. It was her childhood name, and the handwriting was identical to her mother's, preserved at home. She held the note, her fingertips trembling, tears streaming down her face. She finally understood. Her mother had never forgotten her. She had just been unable to find her in the chaos. This note, perhaps written by her mother all those years ago, had been preserved in the city's memory. Someone had written, "Thank you, city, for embracing my sorrow." Another note read, "May we all be treated with kindness in the days to come." Still another, "Those who have passed are never truly gone. They have become part of the city, watching over us." Marian walked over to the sleeper and gently touched its bronze surface, feeling the warm patina of time beneath her fingertips. Just then, a light breeze blew, and a small note landed in her palm. The handwriting was delicate, as if written with a quill, the ink a pale blue, similar to her mother's note, yet with an older, more timeless quality. "Thank you for returning sleep to those who dream. The city." Marian looked up at the square, the wind carrying the toll of church bells and the aroma of coffee from the cafe. Suddenly, she felt she could hear the city's breath, slow and steady, emanating from the cracks in the cobblestones, the walls of the old buildings, and the bronze veins of the statue. Marianne looked up at the sunrise in the distance. Golden sunlight broke through the clouds, spilling over the cobblestones and onto the faces of passers-by, casting a warm glow. She thought of Etienne's final smile, the words in her great-grandfather's diary, and the look of relief on the faces of the citizens who had shared their stories. She knew the city's healing was not over. It had simply begun in a gentler, warmer way. Trauma never disappears, and memories are never forgotten. But as long as there are people willing to listen and accept, that pain will no longer be a chain holding the city back. She carefully placed the note from the city and her mother's note in her wallet and turned to leave the square. The streets were already bustling with life. The cries of vendors, the chatter of passers-by, the jingle of bicycle bells, weaving into a vibrant symphony of the city. The bakery window displayed freshly baked croissants, emitting an inviting aroma. Flowers outside the florist's shop bloomed in bright colors, vibrant and lively. Marian walked with light steps, the darkness in her heart completely lifted. She knew her journey of memory and redemption was complete, and the city had finally found a new balance through listening and acceptance. She stopped at a street kiosk and bought a copy of the Brussels Free Press. The front page headline was about the memory claim event, accompanied by a photo of citizens sitting around the statue, sharing stories, their faces filled with warm smiles. In the distance, the sleeper stood silently, its closed-eyed, curled posture radiating peace and tranquility. It was like a silent guardian, witnessing the city's past, present, and future, and protecting every fragment of memory hidden in time. The stories that had been heard, the pain that had been accepted, all had merged into the city's bloodstream, becoming part of its life force, flowing quietly with each sunrise and sunset. Marian walked through the streets of Brussels, occasionally pausing to listen to the sounds around her. The laughter of children, the conversation of the elderly, the rustle of wind through leaves. She knew these sounds contained the city's memories and its future. A few days later, Marian returned to the Grand Place and found that the memory exchange box was filled with new notes. Among them was a note with no words, only a small lily of the valley button, identical to the one Pierre had found, with the number 1940 engraved on the back. She picked up the button and held it to her ear, as if hearing faint whispers from a distant era. In the sunlight, the sleeper's bronze surface glowed softly. No one noticed its fingertips moved slightly. The city's story was not over. Its healing was not over. The memories yet to be awakened, the stories yet to be told. Perhaps on some silent night, they would resurface, along with the statue's gentle movement.